Hello and welcome to our live discussion with the CGTN on global recovery, the pandemic, the climate, and inclusive growth. Well, now we're actually 3 years into the COVID-19 pandemic. In some countries, infections rates have fallen significantly, while in others, the virus remains difficult to control. But whether governments are actively managing outbreaks or returning to normalcy, economic recovery is central to their future agenda. Well, in addition to COVID-19, we're also facing other global crises such as the environmental emergencies. So how do we restart the economy? That's what we're going to discuss today with our distinguished speakers, Dr. Peng Wensheng and Professor Jeffrey Sachs, to look at how policymakers and the private sectors in both China and the United States can aid economic and social recovery. Well, first of all, thank you both for joining us today. I know both of you had quite a busy schedule, and it's a pleasure for us to hear your insights regarding the economic recovery. But before we start our discussion, a very quick introduction of both of our speakers. First, Dr. Peng Wensheng, he's the Chief Economist of China International Capital Corporation, or CICC. He's the head of the CICC Research Department, as well as the Executive Director of CICC Global Institute. And also we have Dr. Jeffrey Sachs, Professor and Director of the Center for Sustainable Development in Columbia University. Jeffrey Sachs is also the president of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, and he has also served as a special advisor to UN Secretaries General during Kofi Annan and Peng and Antonio Guterres' time. So let me start with you, Dr. Peng. So what is the role of fiscal and monetary policies in economic recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, you think?
The COVID-19 pandemic has had major disruptive effects on economic activities, production, consumption, transportation, logistics. So we have had a significant downward pressure on economic growth globally, and also increase in unemployment, decline in income. And in China's case, this year we have in particular slowdown in economic growth. And there are two reasons why we believe that fiscal policy is more important than monetary policy. First, we are facing a strong pro-cyclical momentum in the economy because of the reduced confidence and increased uncertainty about the future. And the fiscal policy is much more effective than monetary policy in terms to be a strong counter-cyclical tool. The other reason is that the pandemic and the control and prevention measures have had asymmetric effects on different groups of people, different regions, different sectors. And therefore, policy response need to be more targeted than in the conventional cyclical downturn of the economy. And on that front, fiscal policy through tax and transfer spending measures are also more effective in terms of targeting specific areas. And of course, this doesn't mean that monetary policy is not required. Monetary policy, I think, monetary policy easing is required to support fiscal expansion. So I think looking forward to 2023, and particularly China's case, my view is that fiscal policy should play a key role in supporting economic recovery, whereas monetary policies should provide a conducive monetary and financial environment for the fiscal policy and for the economy more generally.
So how about you, Dr. Sachs? Do you agree? And what do you think the role of the both fiscal and monetary policies in economic recovery from this pandemic?
Well, we are experiencing lots of disruptions to the world economy, clearly, as Dr. Peng has said, and we should direct our attention in significant part to reducing those disruptions. So the disruptions include, of course, the pandemic itself, which broke supply chains and led to a lot of disruptions of behavior and travel and trade. We also have disruptions from the war in Ukraine, from the sanctions regime that was put on by Western countries in response to the war, which has disrupted the global supplies of fertilizers and foodstuffs and energy. And we also have disruptions from the geopolitical tensions between the US and China, because the US has imposed various trade and financial and technological barriers to the open relations between the US and China. I regret those actions. I don't think they have been very correct, but they have disrupted the world economy further. And so really the questions are how to face those shocks, what to do about COVID, what to do about the war, what to do about the sanctions, what to do about the bilateral relationship between the US and China. In other words, we need to direct attention to the underlying challenges, as well as to the roles of monetary and fiscal policy, partly to compensate for those shocks and to respond to those shocks. So it's a complicated scenario, but I would like to just add the ideas that first, the war in Ukraine should end quickly through negotiations. This is really important. An ongoing war will disrupt the world economy. The sanctions regime against Russia should be ended, aligned with a negotiated end to the war. The geopolitical tensions between the US and China should be reduced, and the US export barriers to China, in my view, should be reduced or eliminated to restore normal economic relations. And on COVID, it's very difficult, but it's quite clear that China will move to a new kind of COVID policy because the Omicron variant is so infectious, it's not really controllable in the same way that the earlier variants were. And so that requires a different response. Fortunately, China also has very, very high immunization rates, and that protects the population. And fortunately, also, the Omicron variants are simply not as lethal, thank goodness, as the original variants were. So I think we can do better on the COVID response. I think we can do better on the geopolitics. I think we can end the war. And then monetary and fiscal policy will have a much easier time because they'll be adjusting to a more normal economic and geopolitical situation. So I think when you have these big shocks, it's important not to just take them as given, but actually to solve them.
Well, apart from the pandemic and also the geopolitical conflicts, as Sachs has just mentioned, we are also, facing many other challenges these days, such as the climate change. The climate shocks, for example, this summer, extreme heat and drought conditions are battering actually in both the U.S., Europe, compounding problems for workers and business at a time when the economic growth is already slowing sharply. Dr. Peng, let me go to you first. So how do you compare these impact of economic shocks nowadays relative to economic crises in the past?
Well, if we compare with crisis, economic crisis in the past few decades, I think we have two notable differences. One is that we are facing, in terms of economic effect, is supply shock foremost and first. For example, the disruptive effect from the pandemic, from the war mentioned, the Russia-Ukraine conflict mentioned earlier by Professor Sachs, climate changes. So all these are not familiar shocks. We are familiar with most of the demand shocks in the previous 3 decades. Now we are facing something that we knew well probably in 1970. So that's one thing. The other thing is, I think, as Professor Sachs put it very well earlier, that we are facing non-economic forces. This pandemic, the war, climate changes, they are originated from non-economic sources, including geopolitical tensions. So they are public health crisis, climate crisis, geopolitical problems, tensions. So this means that I think we need to pursue policies not only in traditional, conventional macroeconomic policies like fiscal and monetary policies. We need to go to the roots of the problem. And therefore, we need, for example, international cooperations between the major countries, like China, on public health, on maintaining peace in this world, right? The geopolitical tensions, how we can reduce it. And as Professor Sachs mentioned earlier, the most important thing at this point of time is to end the conflict, end the war in Russia and Ukraine. And of course, we need to take urgent actions on climate change and the energy crisis, energy supply crisis. This year in Europe has reminded us the security of energy supply in the short term and the longer term green transition or longer term carbon neutrality. How should we balance these two objectives? I think there also we need to strengthen cooperation, coordination between the major economies. So I believe we are facing, a lot of new issues in the period to come. Something that we're not used to in the past 2 or 3 decades. So we need to find new solutions.
Well, I'm glad actually you touched on the stagflation during the 1970s. So, Jeffrey, so you've also mentioned earlier in an interview said that the U.S. inflation is hitting a 40 years high. That some say, this situation reminds them of what happened in the 1970s, as Dr. Peng has just mentioned earlier. So, what do you think? Should we expect the stagflation to affect more countries and last longer this time?
Well, one of the facts of getting older is that I remember the 1970s very well, and more than that, I wrote my PhD dissertation in 1980 on supply shocks of the 1970s, and my first book was in 1982 called The Economics of Worldwide Stagflation. So for me, this is deja vu. I'm seeing again what I saw in the 1970s. In the 1970s, we had war in the Middle East, so geopolitical conflict. We had oil shocks, which were related to the geopolitics. And we had a breakdown of the monetary system that had been put in place for the market economies after World War II, called the Bretton Woods system. And it was those 3 things that led to the stagflation of the 1970s. So we're in a related period now because we have disruptions from war. We have disruptions from the pandemic, which is a different kind of supply shock. We have disruptions from the environment, which is very serious and ongoing supply shock. And we have disruptions on the monetary side as well for many complicated reasons. One of which that's interesting is that when the pandemic began in 2020, the US Federal Reserve, our central bank, massively expanded the money supply by several $1 trillion. Their idea was to prevent a financial crisis coming from the pandemic. But they, in a way, overshot because they expanded the money supply so much. They did avoid the financial crisis in 2020, but they created the inflation of 2022. So we're living through this tumultuous period. Let me say that first, how long the tumult goes on depends on how we approach issues like the war and geopolitics, as both Dr. Peng and I are emphasizing. But I would also add on climate, we're going to have worsening climate shocks for decades because this is a slow-moving process. We have built up global warming through decades, indeed much more than a century of use of fossil fuels and other changes in the global economy. So the world climate is going to continue to change adversely for at least decades, more gradually, even for centuries is possible. But for decades to come, we'll have more droughts, more floods, more heat waves, and this requires two kinds of responses. One is to finally take actions so that we don't make it even worse in the future by making the transformation to zero carbon energy. In other words, moving to wind, solar, nuclear, and other safer kinds of energy that don't wreck the climate. The other is we have to make our societies much more protected and resilient because we know that the Earth is going to continue to warm. And we know that we're going to have serious problems from that. But we're only in the first steps of making resiliency because politics works slowly, even slower sometimes than is needed. And I can give you an example. We had a massive hurricane in New York City in 2012, a huge one. We had something like $60 billion of direct damage. And then some engineers came up with plans how to protect New York City from flooding. But that will require 20 or 30 or $40 billion of investments. It's a good idea, but the politicians have been fighting ever since how to actually pay for it. Who's going to pay? How is it going to be financed? So nothing has happened since that last hurricane. Now, sometime we're going to have another disaster, but will we have made any progress at all in being more prepared for it? And you can think about many places in the world, like Pakistan, which had a terrible disaster this year. 1/3 of the country, of the whole country, was flooded, and many people died. But Pakistan doesn't have the means to address this on its own. Pakistan barely is financially solvent right now, or let's say liquid. It can't get finance on normal terms. And so it requires China and the United States to work together, and Europe, to help Pakistan to adjust. But if we don't talk to each other, we're not working together, we're not going to solve those problems. So this is very complicated. And everything comes back to what Dr. Peng said. We need more cooperation globally. We need to be working together, brainstorming together, investing together. So there'll be a lot of investment, which is good. That will create jobs, that will even create economic growth, but it has to be on a cooperative basis, because no country by itself can solve the problems that we face.
I think both of you had made your points quite clear that, you know, we need more sort of like international cooperations to facing and solving all these problems. But one more questions before we moving on to our next topic. So in the long run, what would be the major challenges and drivers for economic growth? Dr. Peng, do you want to go ahead and answer this question?
In addition to the short-term effects from pandemic or military conflict, I think the global economy faces supply-side constraints that we are not familiar in the past 2 or 3 decades in the period going forward. And that includes, for example, population aging. And like in China's case, you know, we have seen already a decline in the labor force, in the working age population. Right? And in other major economies also, the population aging means slower growth of labor supply. We are facing issues with climate change, with carbon neutrality that you know, were mentioned by Professor Sachs earlier. I believe overall, for some period, I think for some years to come, that will have an impact on the supply side of the global economy. Then we have geopolitical tensions. Increasing number of countries started to increase defense spending. Defense spending, you know, every country increases defense spending. From the individual point of view, it seems a rational action, a rational decision, given what has happened. But if you add, you know, the countries together for the whole world, the security will not improve because of, you know, increased spending on defense. But that defense spending will crowd out resource utilization in other sectors of the economy, which means, in my view, also a source of supply side constraint. So all this put together, I believe it means that for the global economy, we need to innovate. We need to increase more spending on scientific research so that we can improve efficiency on the supply side. Now, Professor Sachs mentioned earlier, you know, this we need to coordinate. We need to working together. Actually, in the past 3 decades, I would say, I would characterize the globalization as a G2 model. So the US has been a major innovator, you know, doing the innovation, frontier innovation. China offers the largest market, the largest working force, largest manufacturing production facilities. So these two work together, everybody. So US companies have made a lot of profits, and those profits support innovation in the US further. Actually help to maintain US competitive position in the scientific research. China has benefited by learning by doing, you know, in catching up in technology areas. And the whole world benefits from reduced cost of the commercialization of new innovations. Now, unfortunately, you know, this successful model, G2 model, is now, you know, we're facing challenges and difficulties. So there's increasing talk about, you know, decoupling in the US. So I think that's a major challenge going forward in terms of the longer term growth potential. So actually on this point, actually very much would like to hear what Professor Sachs think about, this decoupling story, or this voice, which has been raised by a lot of people.
Well, Jeffrey, this stage is yours.
Great, I'd be happy to. I agree with Dr. Peng. I think the G2 model, the globalization model, has worked very well. And of course, China was a great beneficiary of it because China was a poor country in 1980, and it achieved spectacular economic growth, and that's a wonderful thing. It means improved conditions of life for well over 1 billion people. This is a phenomenal progress, and we see advances in other places, not quite so dramatic, but also benefiting from the globalization. And the United States as well has benefited from the globalization. But two things happened in the US that changed the mood. One was that globalization created a lot of benefits, but it created some harms in the US. Some industries declined while others increased. But the US politicians blamed China for the decline rather than doing the hard work of readjusting the US economy itself to make sure that everybody would benefit from these changes. In other words, we say the pie got bigger, but it was shared in a different way. And if the US politics had been better, we would have had a fairer sharing of the benefits of globalization. Instead, we had politicians like Donald Trump, who said, oh, China is to blame for your problems. Well, this was a very narrow, economically illiterate point of view, because what the United States needed was a more robust social benefit system. And we didn't put that in place. Instead, the US turned against globalization. The second problem, ironically, is that China's very success made some American politicians and strategists turn against globalization because they view the world in a zero-sum struggle. They say if China is doing better, that's bad for the US. Of course, that's a horrible view, in my opinion. It's very nasty, very self-centered, very short-sighted, and very dangerous because it leads to conflict. But that is the real view of many American leaders, I'm sorry to say. And when I read a lot of the foreign policy ideas in the US, they say we must contain China. Again, what a ridiculous idea. First, it's not possible. Second, it's not desirable. And third, it is not beneficial to the US in any way. But it is an idea that also has really taken hold because American politicians got scared of China's success. I think that this is wrong for many reasons. First, China's success will benefit the world, really, because China will become a major technological innovator. And already China has been the low-cost provider, for example, of the solutions for the energy crisis, for the low-cost solar power, the low-cost wind power. This is a wonderful thing. And this is a benefit for the world, not a threat to the world. Second, China has lots of problems internally, lots of challenges. So this is like every place. China, as Dr. Peng said, is aging. China's median age will be in the mid-50s later this century. So there'll have to be a lot of social changes and a lot of economic changes for an older population. This is true around the world, but quite dramatically in China. And so we should understand, we don't want to stop anybody's economic progress. We actually need to help each other to cope with all of the challenges that we're going to be facing, not seeing other parts of the world as a source of struggle or threat or danger. That's an outmoded, ancient view maybe, but a wrong idea. So all of this means the US has turned against, not even the US, by the way, this is our political leadership, turned against globalization, both as a political tactic to explain to parts of the US population that fell behind, oh, it's not our fault, it's China's fault. And partly out of this fear. I'll stop here. I'm sorry to go on so long, but all of it, to my mind, I apologize for being so long-winded, just to say this decoupling idea is a terrible idea. That's my bottom line. It's a mistake. It's from people who don't understand the world economy. It's from short-term ideas. It's simply wrong. But it unfortunately has a lot of momentum behind it right now. I do my best every day to try to tell the American politicians, you're wrong. You're making a mistake about this whole issue.
Of course, I think we've kind of had this conversation last month when we met in Bali for the G20 summit. Of course, China is not the reason to blame for the US veering away from the globalization. But what are the reasons behind the rising inequality in the US if China is of course not the reason to blame, and to what extent can globalization be responsible for it, you think?
Well, globalization probably increased inequality in the US a little bit, but it also made the United States on average richer. So it would be possible to have redistribution in the US that could ensure that everybody is benefited. The winners could help those who were left behind. That's the first point. Globalization on the whole is a positive force. Even if some people lose from it, those who gain more than those who lose. And so they can help if there's a proper social system in place, which there isn't right now in the US, because the US rich are not nice to the US poor. We don't have the idea of common prosperity. We have the idea you're on your own. And that is too nasty a vision. So this is one point. But there's another point that's very important, and that is that technological change especially has meant that there's been added benefits for people with higher education, people with advanced technical training, and people that have less education are left behind in this process. That's not about globalization. That's about the nature of rapid technological change, especially digital change, where the machines replace the workers to an important extent. In many places, you go to an automobile factory and the assembly line is robots. So the people that used to have jobs with a high school education can't get those jobs anymore. So that requires also a social response, and that requires better education for all. It actually enables people to have more leisure time if we share the benefits of technological advance properly. If we end up with a few multi-billionaires and many people who are poor, then that technological change is not going to be to the benefit of society as a whole. I think that's why in China there's so much discussion about the idea of common prosperity, because technological change does promote inequalities, and it is the responsibility of the society as a whole to reduce those inequalities. And my view is, for example, that the state should guarantee quality education for all, that the state should guarantee health care for all, that the state should guarantee basic infrastructure for all. Then people have to work, of course, for their livelihoods. They have to work hard for their effort. They have to seek good education, because that requires personal responsibility too. But it does mean that there's a societal responsibility that goes along with the personal responsibility. And this is, I think, this challenge of inequality. China faces it, the United States faces it. Europe, which tends to be more equal, also has had tendencies towards higher inequality. What really becomes a big problem is if the political system is taken over by the rich, which is what happened in the United States to a large extent. So the rich don't care too much for the poor. And if the political system is too much in the hands of the rich, then the political system does not respond to the needs of most of society. That's really a big problem in the United States, because we have billionaires who fund the political campaigns. And then they say to the politicians, we paid for your election, now you give us tax cuts. And if society works like that, it's not going to work very effectively.
Well, let me turn to you, Dr. Peng, for this question. As trade protectionism and populism rise, the era of hyper-globalization seems to be an end. So how do you think this will affect China and other developing countries?
As Professor Sachs mentioned earlier, China and many emerging market economies have benefited a lot from globalization in the past few decades. So we are facing new challenges. I would say that I would make 2 points. One is that in China's case, China has a big scale. We have the largest population, or one of the 2 largest. Maybe I don't know. I'm not sure whether India or China have the largest population now, but we're close, right? We have the largest labor force. And much larger than India's case, because India's they have a lot of more children, and women's participation rate is significantly lower in India than in China. So we have a much larger labor force. We have over 200 million people who have received higher education, right, compared with below 100 million in the US and in India, respectively. So I agree with what Professor Sachs mentioned earlier. It's difficult, probably impossible to try to contain the economic progress in China. I believe part of the reason, large scale on both the demand side and the supply. And in economics jargon, we call it increasing return to scale. Right? So as you increase the size, the average cost, the unit cost of production declines. And I believe that's the reason why China has become the largest exporter of manufactured goods, for example. So as we move into the so-called knowledge-based economy, or digital, like I mentioned earlier, this economy of scale or economy of scope, this effect will become even more important. So I think there will be more competition between the 2 large economies, China and the US. And I believe, provided this is a competition that benefits both sides, I think, or this competition does not turn into a very hostile one. I think we should not be too pessimistic going forward. And indeed, there are important areas that require working together by China and the US. The pandemic, the climate change, geopolitical, the world peace, etc. So we face new challenges, but I would say we should not be too pessimistic.
If I could add just one thought, most of the world certainly wants to keep an open global economy. And so I think even if the United States is turning more protectionist, China should really continue to exercise and promote openness and initiatives, in my view, like the Belt and Road Initiative are very positive, very important. China should remain a major exporting country because China should export lots of infrastructure and manufactured goods and technology. And there's a ready market worldwide for that. Even if the US market closes a bit, most of the world is in the developing world, and most of the world wants that open relationship. And I think China was very wise to create new institutions like the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, like the New Development Bank and so forth. So I just want to encourage that if the United States goes more protectionist, China shouldn't only look to its own internal economy. The international model works for China and it works for the world, and it should be actually continued to be pursued, even if the US goes a little bit off course. Of course, I hope the US continues to be constructively competitive and constructively cooperative. But in any event, we need a global economy, and China should and would play a huge role in that global economy, even if the United States isn't being as constructive as it should be.
Well, we're actually running out of time, but before I let you two go, let's move really quick to the next topic. We're going to touch a bit on that as well, the green transformation and carbon neutrality. You know, how these days people are talking about climate change, how the global temperature is rising, and lots of countries globally have made their commitment to the carbon emissions peak and the neutrality. For instance, China is committed to its carbon emission peak by 2030 and carbon neutrality by 2060. So I want to this one question to both of you. So how should public sectors or financial sectors and other private sectors collaborate in facilitating all this green transformation? Dr. Peng, do you want to go ahead and start this one?
Okay. We have a major challenge going forward in terms of dealing with or coping with climate change. But also we have seen significant progress. I believe mentioned earlier by Professor Sachs, that is, for example, renewable energy, the cost of renewable energy, and drastically. So that provide opportunities and provide, I would say, confidence going forward. In my view, what we need is to accelerate this process. And how should we accelerate this progress? For example, we need to increase more government support, government spending on research and development. We need to increase public capacity to encourage spending on application of new technologies, commercialization of innovations. We need to, for example, carbon pricing, the regulatory tool to correct what we call externalities of carbon emissions. And finally, we need more green finance. And Europe, China, and also US have been taking a lot of measures in this area.
How about you, Jeffrey? Do you have anything to add on?
I have two quick additions. I agree with everything Dr. Peng said. One is I think that the regional comprehensive economic partnership, which is China, Japan, Korea, ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand, the 15 countries should create a zero carbon energy system together, because this is a great group of countries that can make an interconnected clean energy system. So regional cooperation would be huge. Second, I'd like to challenge China to get to zero by 2050. China is so good at what it does. The technologies are improving so fast. The integration of digital and green is taking place in China dramatically. The long distance transmission is another Chinese specialty. I'd like to challenge China to help lead that RCEP region to net zero by 2050, because we need to move as fast as possible. It will create a lot of economic dynamism, a lot of technological progress, and a lot of positive spillovers for the whole world.
All righty, thank you both. Thank you so much for your insightful points of view sharing with us, and for those who are joining us online, all these viewers, thank you. Thanks for your time, and hopefully we can catch up with both Dr. Peng and Dr. Sachs in the near. Thank you guys.
Fantastic.
Thanks
so much. Great to be with you.
Thank you.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Peng